Hello there, and welcome to this, the 227th edition of DF Direct Weekly, our weekly show where we discuss the latest gaming and technology news. And I think it's fair to say that we're experiencing the calm before the storm that is Gamescom 2025. So, not a huge amount of game-changing topics here, but certainly plenty to discuss. First of all, joining me, Oliver Mackenzie. Hello.
Yes, Rich, another week, another DF Direct, more topics. Should be fun.
And he's back. Tom Morgan, hello.
Hello. Yeah, here to, I guess celebrate the fact we're gone independent, and I'm still here, just to say.
Of course. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, obviously you weren't in the main announcement video, but everyone involved in the video side of DF is now joining us on this new fully independent venture. Not a huge amount to report actually on that front since we last discussed it in the last week's Direct, except to say there's a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes related to sorting out stuff like, well, who's going to be representing us in terms of commercial sales. Not exactly hugely exciting to the audience, but fundamentally very, very important to the business. Appointing accountants. We've done that. We can now pay people. We've got cash flow sorted. That was something that, when you're basically moving from one company to another, that's a logistical hurdle that needs to be overcome. A lot of incredibly dull stuff, which, has to be done. But obviously exciting times ahead, and everything's going to kick off with Gamescom, and it's great to be able to attend in a kind of fully independent capacity. But with that, let's move on to our first news topic. Okay, so first news topic of the week. We're actually going to be recording this one out of order with the rest of the Direct. It's the Battlefield 6 open beta. It's continued over this weekend, and the reason we are recording it out of sequence is so we can actually play it for a bit. The Direct is typically recorded on a Friday morning. Obviously Oliver's done a great deal of work on the console versions of the game. That video is already out there, and I think it sort of establishes that Battlefield 6 is a force to be reckoned with in many ways. What we didn't look at so far was the PC version of the game, or the beta rather, because Alex is away. And I thought I would take a very, very quick look at it and give you some impressions on what I thought of it. And Oliver, after that, you're going to be talking about the new map that's been added.
I am.
Which should be quite interesting. Let's get into the PC version first. Let's talk about settings first of all, those all-important settings. I think what's quite interesting about this one, Oliver, is that there seems to be a push from DICE to kind of give you console equivalent settings out of the box, which I certainly found a bit interesting. You've got balanced and performance modes, and there are behaviors between them which seem to be very common with the console versions, like balanced locking you to 60 frames per second with VSync, performance unlocking, but you can of course change the VSync setting to off, so you can use the balanced mode with VSync off if you prefer. That's an odd decision. I wonder what you make of it.
Well, it certainly does suggest there's some homogeneity between the PC approach and the console approach there. In consoles, you're looking at a balanced mode by default, and you get this like high performance mode that you can engage on every console but the Series S, I believe, where you basically get, It seems like pretty similar visual settings to the balanced mode, but you get that frame rate unlock, and indeed without VRR, you get that VSync unlock as well. You get the return of tearing, which is not so flattering there. But on PC, it's kind of a dense settings menu. There are a lot of sub-menus to it, right? You have to go through advanced settings, and there's a different section for the display output. There are some confusing things, like I know we were talking over the weekend. They use a resolution scale as a 1% in their display options. And then also separately have quality levels for the upscaler, which is kind of confusing, right? So you'd assume, okay, well, maybe the percentage overrides the quality levels for the upscaler, but no, it's totally different. The percentage just sets the output percentage of screen resolution, after which it does like a naive spatial upscale. And then the internal resolution is set by the FSR, DLSS, or XeSS quality sliders. It's just very confusing. It's conceptually a confusing menu. It's a dense menu. It's a hard one to get through. And ultimately, the visual settings that you do configure, I think we'll find out that actually you can probably run the game at pretty high settings. You don't need to worry about them too much while still maintaining quite good performance.
Yeah, the settings menu. So obviously you have like that, that sort of global resolution scale there, and then you are able to sort of set DLSS to performance quality, the standards, right? So I guess the point is that the footage here I've got of the Ryzen 5 3600 with the 5060 Ti, I actually. I'm saying it's 1440p here, but it is actually a 4K capture at 67% resolution scale with the DLSS factor at whatever it is there. So yeah, it's kind of it's very interesting sort of scenario there. But ultimately, I think it's kind of cool that it gives you that that sort of ability to have like double scaling, as it were, because DLSS, any sort of upscaler has a computational cost. You can lower that cost and then sort of upscale to final display output resolution there. So that's pretty cool. But I think a lot of people may be slightly confused because the stuff that is a traditional PC graphics menu is kind of hidden away under the advanced options that you've got there. So you have to dig deep, perhaps too deep, to find that stuff. But let's talk about PC performance because, we lauded the console versions, right? And I think there is a lot to give DICE credit for on this. I'm going to talk first of all about the Ryzen 5 3600 with the 5060 Ti. It's a 16 gig model. It's kind of like ballpark what a PS5 Pro is like from GPU and CPU resources. And pretty much always above 70 frames, pretty much always above 60 frames per second, rather. But obviously, that's a bit of a blanket statement because there are various levels with varying levels of complexity. Cairo seems to be pretty heavy. That's where you're in your sort of 70s there. What you'll note, though, which I found quite interesting, is the frame time graph on the bottom right there. It's quite spiky. I realized that the millisecond range there, 0 to 40 milliseconds, is quite tight. But you can see that it's pretty spiky there, which kind of says to me that there's a CPU limitation in effect there with that 3600, which kind of makes sense, I guess. It is a very old CPU at this point. We just keep it around mostly for console equivalents and also because AMD shifted untold millions of them. There's a lot of 3600s out there. But yeah, high settings, balance settings. I use DLSS balance mode at 1440p, and I'd say the experience was pretty great overall, actually. I was quite impressed with what a relatively mediocre CPU could do here. GPUs probably being underfed. I should have really find time to put in the 4060, but I think this pretty much gives you an idea of the lie of the land on what is like a mid-range system, low to mid-range system, I think, at this point. So, yeah, I mean, no stutters, I guess, was the other thing. And maybe one stutter. But the thing about PC gaming is that if you're gaming for hours and you encounter a stutter, there's a very good possibility it's not actually your PC, or rather not actually the game doing that, but rather some sort of background task that your PC has suddenly decided to kick in. The overview map actually seems to be quite CPU intensive, which I found quite interesting. But that's the lie of the land for the 3600 there. Obviously, the different levels, different performance levels. The Liberation Peak level is actually significantly less heavy, and there the frame times are kind of like more what I consider to be sort of GPU limited. There's much flatter, not quite as spiky. So pretty good, and I guess probably in line with what you were looking at on consoles, by and large. Pretty impressive show overall, I think. I'd say this is looking really, really impressive, and I kind of get what you're saying when you said that it's kind of shippable in this state already. Certainly the multiplayer that we've had access to is pretty cool, right? I was really had a good time with it. Totally hopeless at the game, of course, but it's quite a spectacle. I wanted to talk quickly also about the high-end experience. So I used my test system, 9800X3D with an RTX 5090, and I just ran 4K DLLA because why wouldn't you? And basically usually above 120 frames per second there, just fully tapped out. Obviously, that will change according to content. Because the nature of multiplayer games is that it's going to be quite heavy. Switching things over to DLSS quality mode, though, obviously that does give you an appreciable frame rate increase, but I wasn't actually running anything like Reaver Tuner or anything while this was running. But I kind of guessed that the CPU was doing a lot more work because my CPU cooler actually spooled up. Yeah. But even so, what I found quite interesting about that is that with the 9800X3D, the frame times were still pretty good there. So even if we are kind of seeing a mixture of being CPU and GPU limited there, frame times were still great, still no stutter, obviously. I'm really excited by this. I think this is pretty good going. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to do a sort of big in-depth look at the PC version. I mean, it's looking pretty good from what I'm seeing so far, based on like a lower end system and a higher end system. Notoriously difficult to benchmark a multiplayer game, of course, because it's so dynamic. I think the only way you could really do head to heads is if you've got two people on two different PCs in the same instance. That would kind of normalize load. But beyond that, yeah, I'm very, very excited by this. But let's talk about the new level.
Yeah, we should talk about the new level because I think this is interesting. I've seen a very wide spectrum of reactions, I should say, to the game's overall presentation, to this beta overall, but certainly the game's presentation especially, because a lot of people are really clamoring for this kind of super lightweight experience that can run at a really fast clip on all systems. And other players are a little bit disappointed in the absence of ray tracing or virtual shadow maps or virtualized geometry systems or what have you. Basically, this kind of cavalcade of current gen features here. And this new map is kind of a good testing ground for those technologies a little bit, and kind of some of the advantages and disadvantages perhaps of DICE's approach here. So the map itself is quite exciting. It's called Empire State, set in Brooklyn. And we'll say that the Rush variant seems a little bit imbalanced, but they seem to be tuning that moment to moment by changing the MCOM timings, 30 seconds to 45 seconds back and forth, doing a number of different kind of variants in the mix there to try to get it into a good level of balance there for attackers and defenders. But I found it an overall quite good map to just play moment to moment. And it does look quite good, I would say, in the kind of exterior shots. Looks pretty all right there, I would say. Nothing extraordinary, but like it looks visually dense. It reads in a pleasing manner. It's got that kind of sunset tone. It looks quite nice. But then I think you go into kind of interior areas and you start to see a little bit more, some of the elements that I think people are complaining about a little bit with this title. Like some of the interior areas are very boxy and geometric, and they remind me of like Operation Locker and Battlefield 4 in like 2013, where you just have these really boxy areas which don't look very pleasing. They look very simple, and they don't really look like real world locations in the same way that some of the exteriors really sell as real world locations, as true to life things. Also, in a lot of the interiors, you're seeing non-shadow casting lights. You're going into a diner, you're seeing like tables, chairs, whatever, not casting any shadows, totally just sitting in place with a light bleeding through them, and it does not look very appealing at all there. Looks very last generation, I'd say, in a lot of those respects, which is unfortunate. And then also you have these screen space reflections. Now, in some instances, I think they look okay, but they do look very artifact prone when you're actually moving the camera around. Lots of noise in them. When there's like bits of, things flowing through the air, things like papers and other detritus, that gets in the way and creates these ugly occlusion holes in the SSR in a way that I think we've seen very prominently in other Battlefield titles, especially in Battlefield 2042. This had a very bad tendency to do this, and we're certainly seeing some of that behavior here. So I think like this is a game where maybe certain kinds of environments really show off this game at its best. In some of the other, like Siege of Cairo, some of the other maps we've seen in the game, I think they have like more diffuse surfaces. They have a lot of props in the scene, very dense environments, not too many like interior spaces, large interior spaces where the GI kind of falls apart and more maybe you get that nasty SSR treatment.
Right.
But yeah, I think there is basically a bit of a tale of two halves with this game, where sometimes it looks, I would say, really good, and it's still very light and it's very appealing, and you're really feeling it. And then in some other scenarios where you're dealing with some of these more complex lighting scenarios, or maybe just in some interiors where the geometry is not too pleasing, where the model density is not too pleasing, and you are noticing like this feels a little bit more like an older Battlefield game in some ways that are maybe not too appealing. And then you kind of get a little bit upset there's not ray traced reflections in the mix or something. Right. But yeah, just kind of a bit of a reflection there. I think overall it's still a very positive story from this beta. Like I've seen a lot of very positive feedback on the gameplay, a lot of very positive feedback on weapon balancing, classes, things like this. But the visual presentation, I think, will probably be a sticking point for some time to come with this title, although I think there are some very positive elements. Like you mentioned, performance is superb. In general, the game looks very good. Consoles are in totally shippable state. Like, I would agree with that totally. So we'll have to see for the final release. And we'll also have to see, like, if the campaign changes things up in any meaningful sense, if the graphics might be improved there, if they might throw in some unexpected visual features we aren't necessarily seeing in this early preview. But yeah, just a couple thoughts there. I think this new map is, like, not quite as flattering, basically, to the game's overall aesthetic as the other ones that are in this package.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't played this before. This was my first time with Battlefield 6. And I have to say that I get exactly what you're saying, because it's kind of like a really unkind way of describing it would be to say it's a throwback. But I think it's a throwback in the right way, in that they've gone back and basically recaptured the essence of Battlefield. But I don't think they've... that there was always like an association between DICE and absolute cutting edge visuals, right? And this isn't what we're getting this time around. We're not getting like super high-end visuals. What you are getting is like the essence of Battlefield brought kicking and screaming back to today with destruction ramped up to the max. And it's a really fantastic experience, right? And I think in the gameplay stakes, they've actually nailed it. But it's not a technological showcase in the way you might have been hoping for, I think. But I still think that it's going to be a massive, massive hit, simply because I think it's delivering what people want, right, from Battlefield. They want that. They want that differentiation from Call of Duty. They want this total destruction. They want those big open areas with a lot going on. They want the sense that anything could happen at any point, which I think they've beautifully captured, because there's some crazy stuff that could happen at any given point. So, kudos to DICE, I think, and for various other studios that seem to be involved. Maybe we need to wait for the next one until we get, the next level in visuals. But, I think they've really whetted our appetites in an extremely compelling manner for this one. And looking forward to see what they come up with. Any final thoughts before we move on?
Not too much. Just to say, it was kind of hard to capture the footage for this video because I was playing HUDless. That was a big detractor to my kill-death ratio. Unfortunately, very challenging to play this game at any level of efficacy when you can't even identify friend from foe here. But no. Other than that, I've had some fun with it. I've been playing it with some friends as well over the weekend. It is that kind of classic Battlefield experience. They are bringing back like that modern military setting, that destruction system, the traditional class structure, defibrillators, like all these elements that people like in Battlefield games. It's basically all back here. Not a lot of new elements, though, like the Behemoth system, I believe, in Battlefield 1, where you had like these zeppelins and trains and boats and crazy things going on with these gigantic ships and nutty things. And that famous, like, if you blew up the zeppelin and it would come down and it'd be all fiery and it would cause a lot of destruction and explosions and stuff like that. That was really fun. Like, there are definitely some elements of those earlier titles that I missed in terms of these kind of signature gimmicks. Not to downplay them, but like signature gimmicks like Levolution, like the Behemoth system. That's not really present here. It really feels like a return to, if anything, like a Battlefield 3, Battlefield 4 kind of experience. That kind of thing is going on here. But yeah, broadly speaking, I've seen only really positive opinions about at least the gameplay structure, balance, maps, things like that. It's been pretty positive so far. So I think they have definitely a hit cooking up here. I heard some reporting that EA might be expecting 100 million players, 100 million copies. I think that's maybe possibly unrealistic, but I think they have a hit on their hands for sure here.
Wow, 100 million. Yeah, okay. Well, I guess we have to wait few months now until we actually see the final game, but obviously really looking forward to it. But with that, let's go back in time to our original filming and indeed Tom. So this week, a new Switch 2 release from Nintendo itself. We have, is it Drag X Drive? Is that the correct pronunciation there, Tom?
I think some people are calling it Drag and Drive, which,
right.
Yeah, but I think you can be forgiven for either, really. Yeah.
Well, I'm using this thing called reading.
Oh yeah.
Where is the and symbol?
I know. I know.
Okay, what are you going with here?
I'll go with drag X drive just because it's the way it's written.
Okay.
But hey, just to get it out there in case we get called out on that.
Okay, so this has been an interesting thing, right? Because it's one of the few Nintendo releases, first-party Nintendo releases I've seen for quite some time where there hasn't been like resounding praise for what has been delivered here. I'm curious what your impressions are there, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't get to cover this one at the London preview event back before the Switch 2 launch. I think we gave it a miss. There were just higher priority things. There was Cyberpunk and all the rest there. But we finally got code in, and yeah, I think you kind of have to measure expectations going into this one. I think the best way to describe it would be, imagine those, the Wii Sports mini games of the Wii launch. It feels like one game out of a batch that has been kind of embellished a bit, made into its own thing, but not terribly much so. It costs $19, £17. So it's a very small sort of scale project. And they've had a shot at basically taking the opportunity to make a case for their Joy-Con mouse controls. And I think the most exciting part of this is literally that there's a dual mouse control scheme here, which we don't have conventionally on PC. We have one mouse, obviously. So Switch 2 can innovate in this one space by having two sides kind of rolling forward or backwards on a flat surface. So that's an interesting concept, and they've kind of worked with it. It's Rocket League-esque, it's fair to say. You're in this kind of basketball half-pipe area. It's a giant hub that you basically load into where you can access all these mini-games, the main courts as well, and there's room for, it's 3v3. I played against CPU, which goes up to like level 9. And there's online play as well, but notably without sort of leaderboards or sort of progression there. That seems to satisfy a lot of people. So it's fairly bare bones, it's fair to say. The mini games around the outskirts are fun, but they're more like a glorified tutorial. And the rest is like, okay, you're just playing 3v3. And the good news is that it is fun. The mechanics are well worked. It is innovative. The bad news for me is I found it quite fatiguing after a while, like having two hands on Joy-Cons rolling forward constantly.
Right, okay. Mm-hmm.
I think that's maybe a problem that's... Yeah, I mean, there's a small handful of titles which are going to support mouse controls, like Metroid Prime 4. And the question that hangs over that is whether it's going to be viable for the long-term, long play sessions. It may be different for you. Honestly, it may be a matter of getting used to. I'm willing to accept that, but it's also clear you will need to adjust to it. And ergonomically, I think the Joy-Con, it's rather thin and small compared to a regular mouse, which has been designed for, a proper grasp from a regular-sized hand. So that is a problem that's almost impossible to overcome. It's just a very tiny, thin thing. In terms of the tech, it's as straightforward as can be. I think there's a lot of parallels with Nintendo doesn't really release its engine names. There's no like Unreal or anything. Like it's just, here's a game. It runs on a engine. But it does look an awful lot like Splatoon in terms of the way the assets are generated, the look of materials. The big difference there being it's got a distinctly less vivid color palette. It's very muted, lots of dark grays and blacks and chrome materials, rubber. So it's immediately a lot more clinical than you'd expect a typical Nintendo game to be, which is full of color and charm. There's some customization in there, but it's fairly minor stuff, and you're still lacking character, which you'd usually associate with a Nintendo game. Image quality, 1440p, well docked, 1080p, portable. It's using basically no anti-aliasing. Surprise, surprise.
Right. Yeah, that's not great, is it? And FSR1 by the look of it, based on some of the declarations.
Yeah, FSR1 is in there
within the game itself.
Interestingly, SMAA also further down the intellectual properties page, so there is.
Right.
It doesn't really look it, though.
No.
Wild.
No, so it's spatial upscaling, basically, and that's kind of your lot. Maybe some image enhancements, but there's not a lot going on there. And, frame rate wise, this is a locked 60. I mean, I don't think any of us expected it to be anything otherwise. It's so simplistic. There's just 3v3 in a very barren sort of lap-like area. There's not much to really talk on there.
Yeah, we did check for 120 FPS support, but it's not there.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I like the look of it. I think it's a great sort of pack-in game. It would be a great pack-in game,
okay.
But it's not been released as such. There's some nice materials in there. Like there's a good sense of gloss on helmets, a matte finish on metals. Some of the thoughts I had going through it. But in typical Nintendo fashion, that keeps the game language very easy to read. But yeah, again, there's not really much there that we haven't seen on Nintendo Switch.
How does this mouse mechanic work in mobile mode? Because obviously you can't really use it there. Is it just like go back to the sticks?
No, that's the thing. There's only this way to play the Joy-Cons. You've got to pull out the Joy-Cons, sit your Switch 2 in tablet mode in front of you with the stand kicked up, and just use the Joy-Cons on the map as you would normally. So there's no alternative control button-based scheme for putting those commands in, which is, to be fair, kind of for the competitive balance online. If people had an option to just use buttons there, then I think everyone just would, because it's more immediate.
Ringing endorsement.
What you mean, the more accessible and easier control method.
Yeah.
People would be too tempted to use it.
Yeah.
Wow. Oliver, what do you think about this?
Well, it's pretty unexciting from a lot of perspectives, because it's like no AA or minimal AA, maybe SMAA in there, but not a real passive, any kind of like temporal anti-aliasing or DLSS. It's using FSR1 for upscaling. It's like 60 FPS and 1440p docked and 60 FPS and 1080p portable. That's like kind of a greatest hits for Nintendo software on Switch 2 so far. It's like
for sure.
Everything Nintendo tends to do in just one title. The exact same thing, pretty much. I mean, the exact same thing as we've seen across a variety of Nintendo software on Switch 2, especially like kind of Switch 1 era kind of visual Nintendo software, ports, enhancements, certainly what we see from there, like Switch 2 editions rather, of the Legend of Zelda titles, things like that. So it's nothing extraordinary technically. One thing that's kind of interesting though is they kind of have this like very uniform lighting presentation where there's like no appearance of like multiple point lights or anything, because obviously they're trying to emulate a basketball court, but it's kind of like the whole thing's being lit by just one uniform light source. That's a little bit bizarre. But yeah, this seems a lot like all the other Nintendo Switch 2 software. I'm still waiting for that, barnstorming, ray tracing, DLSS title from Nintendo, PVR, all the good stuff. We may have to wait a while to see that, unfortunately.
Yeah, I guess the thing is, I'm looking at all of the aliasing and artifacting issues here in Tom's B-roll, and you just think to yourself, DLSS would have cleared up a lot of this kind of continual form of bafflement as to why it's not in there. And I guess we're still stuck with the potential explanation that John had that possibly there's not motion vector support in there. But even so, the system's been in development for so long, you can't help but think that perhaps these engines could have been reconfigured to support this game-changing technology that's been added to it. Just a thought. I think, it's interesting, Tom, you talked about the fact that we saw it at the event, but we didn't actually play it. And I think that's sort of the main problem here, is that there isn't really that sort of Nintendo charm. Basically, you look at a Nintendo game, you kind of want to play it, and that was kind of not what we experienced with this one.
Yeah, they had an opportunity to even throw in just like the standard roster of Mario characters, right? But they went for these very plain-looking, robot-type characters, and it's not quite got that Nintendo feel to it. if they really wanted to embellish it, they could have gone the ARMS route. ARMS was superb on Switch. Had a great similar idea where it's like, okay, let's try something new. Let's mess with the conventions that we're used to in a fighting game, make it a kind of front on. And they created a whole roster of characters which suited that. But here it's just kind of very, very plain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll be interested to see whether they actually evolve this game over time, because I think the single sort of big feedback point in the reviews is that there's just kind of like a lack of content, right?
Yeah, just the 3v3, the mini games, and some unlockable stuff. Like that's really all that's going to keep you for. But then it's only $20, so I guess it's all relative.
Absolutely. Okay, well, not too much more to say about that. Let's move on to our next news topic. Okay, then, so an interesting story I read on Eurogamer this week, and Tekken 8 director Katsuhiro Harada has basically stated that Switch 2 port of Tekken 8 could happen, but it's going to require a lot of work to get there. There was a quote here from an interview at EVO earlier in the month where he stated it's an interesting option, not totally off the table, but it requires a lot of work on the game to get it running on that hardware. From a business standpoint, the Switch 2 is doing quite well, so it would be a very good business decision if you're trying to get a bigger audience, but the amount of work that would have to be done on the game makes it not a very easy decision. At this point in time, there's nothing to announce. But it's an interesting conceit, right, Oliver, the concept of bringing Tekken 8 onto the Switch 2, because on the one hand, this is a current gen only game, right? But on the other hand, it does seem to run quite well with considerable cutbacks on the Steam Deck. And you can kind of use Steam Deck as a sort of plausibility filter for whether a Switch 2 version is kind of viable or not.
Yeah, John already showed this game running on the Steam Deck at 60 FPS with pretty moderate settings tweaks. I think he was looking at a mix of low and medium settings with temporal upscaling from about 480p with TSR to 720p, and he had found that a pretty appealing experience. I also did a long piece looking at Steam Deck versus Switch 2 a few weeks ago, and I think it probably suggests that if this game is running on Steam Deck in a saleable shape, it will probably run well on Switch 2, including in its portable mode, in a fairly saleable shape with some work here. I would think that's probably the case. I'm sure it would be a substantial amount of work, but it's critical here. This is a UE5 title, but it's not using any of the key UE5 features as far as I can tell. There's no VSM, no Lumen, no Nanite. It does look good, but it does not feel like the kind of game that would be a stretch for the console. Even if you look at like the Series S version, that's operating in like a 720p to 1080p window. Which is kind of, a little bit higher than maybe you'd expect from Switch 2. But if you have DLSS in the mix, I think we've seen this from Street Fighter, right? You throw in DLSS, a little bit of a different upscaling solution, you get a pretty good result there. But there are also tweakables they could adjust that are present on Series S that wouldn't necessarily need to be present on Switch 2. Like SSR, do you need SSR on Switch 2? Maybe you cut that. Maybe you reduce the detail modestly in some of the backgrounds. Like there are some concessions you could make on top of that to probably get it in a pretty good shape on Switch 2. I'm sure it would be a substantial amount of work, and maybe it's worth it, maybe it isn't. But I think this is clearly a game that would probably work fine in Switch 2. It doesn't feel like something that's not of a kind with other games we've seen that do work well on the hardware. It's using kind of like PS4 level-ish visual features. It's targeting high resolutions on the home consoles. It would probably be a pretty good fit for Switch 2. And I'd suggest that probably in terms of the kind of market logistics of it, you'd probably sell a lot of units on Switch 2. I think it might be a good fit for the Switch 2 from a market perspective too, because I think Street Fighter 6 has done pretty well. I think people are keen on these kinds of games.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Tom, you looked into this, the sort of viability of this project having already covered Street Fighter 6 on Switch 2.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, as Oliver's saying, like it's about the business proposition of it as well. Like, is it worth the time to re-engineer the game? And from the sounds, based on the interview, it seems like they're not even really considering it. It's almost like the interviewer just raised the idea in their heads. so it's not coming anytime soon. It is kind of take a bit of work. But yeah, Tekken 8 is, astonishing from a tech standpoint in the fighting game space. It's got some stuff like Unreal Engine 5, obviously, as Oliver's talking about, but also on top of that, it's just Street Fighter 6 has made the jump to Switch 2 in a pretty fine form, 60 FPS. The cutbacks speak for themselves, like in res and shadows and the loss of SSR. But I'm very happy with that version. It's a superb take on Street Fighter 6. With Tekken 8, though, we're talking about environments with a lot more CPU pushing stuff. There's physics, like hair, cloth. There's like concrete slabs that smash, the barriers that break. All this stuff, kind of like the secondary animations and the physics on the environment, are a factor that just isn't in Street Fighter 6. There's just not as much of that, or barely any of it, on the environment. So it's that is a big difference. So if they want to, from a CPU perspective, if they want to adjust that for Switch 2, it might be possible. But if they want to keep crossplay intact as well with other platforms, might that be a consideration? Is there going to be too much of a change to make that possible? It's kind of up for debate, really. But yeah, I mean, it's also, it's not just the docked play. They've got to factor in portable. Like with Street Fighter 6, they had, as another fighting game, there are a lot of cutbacks there, which they had to make, in lighting and shadows and all these effects. So, it's whether we want to see a version running at low settings, low medium settings, as like John tried on the Steam Deck test there, and whether we're kind of happy with that sort of ballpark setting for Switch 2.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting that you point out the CPU side of the equation, because although we can kind of use Steam Deck as a bellwether for viability of Switch 2 ports, I think one thing that's coming to light now is that the CPU side of the Switch 2 is sort of considerably pared back. It's not quite on the level of the Steam Deck. So yeah, there's a lot of question marks over that in particular, and we have heard that basically it's almost like a lot of developers are looking to bring over their existing library of games to Switch 2, but at the same time there are games, especially current gen games, where the CPU burden is significantly higher to the point where they're thinking, well, maybe that's not going to happen. On the flip side, you hear about rumored projects like Assassin's Creed Shadows coming to Switch 2, which would have a significant CPU overhead of its own. So it's kind of weird. I think we heard some rumors this week, Oliver, about the Switch 2 using like DLSS 3.1, and there's various sort of leaks about what's happening with the development environment there.
Yeah, that came out. I'm a little bit. I don't know that's necessarily 100% the case. I mean, there could be, the kind of higher end DLSS variant could be indeed DLSS 3.1 or something, a very close variant to that. But there are also, it appears like lower quality DLSS settings, perhaps, at least, titles that are using DLSS that have been confirmed to be using DLSS from the developers like Fast Fusion, like Hogwarts Legacy, that have like no reasonable DLSS characteristics. So look, if anything, they look closer to like FSR 3 or something. They don't look anything like DLSS. And we know they are using DLSS. Certainly like the regular version of DLSS in titles like Cyberpunk 2077 does have some pretty close similarities, I would say, with like DLSS CNN on PC. I would say I think that's a pretty reasonable point of comparison there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, obviously Gamescom next week, John, Alex and I are going to be meeting up, and it's a good opportunity for John to hand over his spare Switch 2 to Alex, and we could actually crack on with doing the long-awaited Alex Battaglia take on DLSS on Switch 2. But yeah, there's going to be, as you quite rightly say, Oliver, there's going to be some games where you can kind of say, right, this is recognizably DLSS. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of comparable to PC from that perspective, but at the same time, there is still this mystery of games that are kind of mooted to be using DLSS, but it doesn't really look like DLSS. So yeah, that's going to be something I hope that Alex can unpick. But with that, let's move on to our next news topic. Okay, so this week there's been some movement in the budget GPU space with the release, or rather the non-release, I guess you could call it, of the non-XT version of AMD's Radeon RX 9060. So 9060 XT, this is a $299 product that anybody can buy. That 8 gig version, that is. There's a 16 gig version that's more expensive and better. Let's just say that. Let's get that out of the way. The 9600 is basically OEM only, so it looks as though it's only going to be available to select companies and within pre-built PCs. And it's an 8GB product, as you may expect. I'm kind of curious as to why it's not getting a general release, because obviously the RTX 5050 is out there. But Tom, you've seen some of the benchmarks that have emerged. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's all from Technosaurus is the original source, the Korean PC analysis there is quite interesting. There's a few games that are kind of, I think if we're comparing it to the 5050, the RTX 5050, it's ahead. Like that's is great news. But I think the more ambitious target would be the RTX 5060. And it's kind of like depending on the game, really. Like there's a few which are like 1 or 2% either side. Cyberpunk and Wukong are about on a par with the non-XT version of the 9060 and the Nvidia's 5060. There's stuff like then Red Dead 2 and Forza Horizon 5, which have a kind of a win for the non-XT variant, and the RTX 5060 comes in at 76%. And 91% of the performance of that, of the non-XT 9060 results. But then other games like, Witcher 3 and Warhammer 40k seem to favor the 5060, the RTX 5060. So a 13% performance advantage over the non-XT AMD card there. So there's a bit of a spread of results, but I guess on the balance of averages across a bunch of games, they are kind of in a very similar ballpark. And it's just whether, I guess, the price point is worth it from AMD's perspective to, even if they were going to release it, right? Because, I mean, the 9060, where are we at? It's kind of, I mean, the
9060 XT is $300,
yeah.
And there were rumors that they were looking to sell the 9060 non-XT for $280, and I think that's kind of...
No.
Well, it is too high.
Yeah, too high.
If they were going to do that.
I've done it all in pounds, sorry. But yeah, the NVIDIA 5050 is £220 right now-ish. I'm sure you could get a deal. And the RTX, RTX 5060 are about 240, 250. Maybe you can get a deal there. So it really has to be less than the 5060 to make it justifiable.
Okay. What do you reckon there, Oliver?
Well, I think this is an interesting product. I guess it's an OEM-only product for now because it's not really cut down that much. It's like a 12% decrease in CUs. It's got the same memory speed and same memory bus as a 9060 XT. The GPU boost clock is down slightly by like 120 megahertz, something like that. It's not very much. It kind of seems more like a die harvested kind of card, something that exists strictly to preserve their yields, basically, than something that is really positioned against the 9060 XT as a product that you launch in the market for a substantially lower price. And that's true, especially because like over these benches, it's like 6% slower than a 9060 XT. That's not really a lot of differentiation between the cards. And like you said, that like mooted $280 price tag might actually be a realistic price, given that the delta in capabilities between the two cards is like even less than that margin of price, right? That's like a 8% margin of price, 6% margin of performance here. That's pretty extraordinary. But of course, because this card is OEM only, it's hard to make too many firm conclusions about the card's positioning if it were to be released as a separate product online potentially, because you can't buy it separately. But logically speaking, it would have to be positioned quite close to the 9060 XT for it to really make sense in the market. Because if it was dramatically cheaper, even like $40 cheaper, $30 cheaper, it would be a pretty key deal at this price point. And yeah, having 8 gigabytes is kind of disappointing and does kind of rule it out for a lot of really demanding current software, current generation software, your Indiana Jones titles like that, your Monster Hunters, things like that. But if you can accept that, then it seems like it'd be a pretty killer deal at anything substantially lower than that kind of like 50-60 tier, 9060 XT tier of pricing.
Right, yeah. I mean, I don't really know what to say about this. I'm looking at the bar charts and there's not really a huge amount of difference between them, right, in any sort of meaningful way. And if you're looking, I guess, when you're looking at a result that's, it's just kind of a bit strange because, anything under sort of 10% performance, it's going to be really difficult for the user to make any kind of distinction between them.
Yeah.
You might as well just get the XT, really. It's a bit more powerful. You might as well just think to yourself, do I really want to spend $300 on a product, or should I actually spend more and get the 16 gig version and actually be safe in the knowledge that I can play games, play any game that comes along? I don't know. I think this is, maybe there's simply like salvage dies that they've got a small amount of them. They can make a small amount of cards. Why not give them to OEMs to do? Let's not make a big deal out of this. I think they're going to struggle to make a case to justify this. It's very, very strange. Let's just put it that way. I just can't really get my head about this. It's sort of almost like a non-event, some might say. But the fact that there is sort of like this deliberate restriction on how you can actually get one kind of speaks to itself, really. Yeah, I don't really know whether there's too much more to say about that, so I guess we should just move on, right? Yeah, sticking with AMD here, some pretty bad news, actually, I think, this week. The classic 5700 X3D, the Ryzen 7 5700 X3D, it's end-of-line, it's coming to an end. And this follows in the wake last year of the 5800 X3D, suffering a similar fate. And I think this is a bit of a shame, really. Well, let's just sort of talk about what this product actually is. It's basically an octo-core chip, 8 cores, 16 threads, but crucially it has that sort of slab of extra cache memory, big cache on there, which, to be fair, has some pretty dramatic improvements to game performance on the CPU side. These processors, I mean, it's a kind of bizarre idea, but it's massively paid off for AMD in delivering Halo products. First of all, for the AM4 platform, which is kind of coming to an end, I guess, DDR4 based. And now moving into the DDR5 era with AM5, obviously, the 9800 X3D is the fastest processor on the market for gaming purposes. It's just absolutely phenomenal. So, yeah, but those chips, the AM4, 5700 X3D, they had a role to play, right? Because they extended the life of older platforms going all the way back to 2017, 2018. So the concepts that you could just plug in a new CPU and, more than double your CPU gaming performance. I think it had a massive role to play in keeping existing systems alive. Oliver, what do you think about this? I mean, there are still X3D products available for AM4, but they seem to be somewhat niche and difficult to find.
Yeah, so there is a 5500 X3D that was just introduced, I think, 2 or 3 months ago, and apparently that's a pretty good part. It's a 6-core part with a turbo at 4 gigahertz, and it has the full 64 megabytes of additional L3 cache, so I think 96 megabytes total. That's a pretty compelling product. And apparently performance is quite good, but it's also Latin American only. It's only available in Latin America. So it's not available broadly across, Asia, Europe, North America, which is kind of a shame because that does seem like a pretty good part. But apparently it's just not being produced, I guess, in sufficient quantities to justify kind of large scale sale there. So it's not end of the line fully, but it basically is end of the line, practically speaking, for widespread availability of these products. And that's too bad because X3D processors are a great way to extract more life out of socket AM4. I have a friend who has like a Ryzen 2000 series CPU upgraded recently to a 5700 X3D. It's a very good upgrade path for people who are on older Ryzen AM4 boards. And those are boards that might have, they might have a system from like 2017 or 2018 and they're able to upgrade to a level where their CPU performance is in line with like reasonably high-end CPUs on AM5 or more recent Intel boards. That's quite compelling there. And it does feel like it's a good, if you can find a 57X3D in stock at a reasonable price, it's a good time to upgrade. And it might be kind of the last reasonable time to upgrade, unless you want to end up in a socket AM5 system or even an AM6 system down the line, or again, high-end Intel or something, because these CPUs are very compelling for gaming performance. In a lot of titles, they really do excel here. And it's kind of your last chance to get on the train before it leaves the station, unfortunately.
Right, yeah. I mean, I got a 5700 X3D from AliExpress for like £130. It was like,
Wow.
stupendously cheap. But, I just remember back in the day looking at The Last of Us Part 1, we were considering like a console equivalent build to see how it would run this pretty poor port as it was at launch. And Ryzen 5 3600, couldn't really get anywhere near to a consistent 60 frames per second. So I just thought, okay, I'm just going to stick in this X3D processor into the exact same rig. And literally, there were sections of the game where it was doubling performance, right? And I think one thing which has been quite interesting in this sort of modern era is that the CPU is actually becoming a lot more important to PC gaming performance than perhaps it was previously. I mean, back in the day, games were primarily developed with, those AMD Jaguars for the last generation consoles. But, obviously moving to this generation, Zen 2, a lot more CPU power for developers to play with, and then mapped onto PC where you want to have much higher frame rates than console, you actually need to push considerably harder to get that performance that you're looking for. And 5700 X3D, 5800 X3D, those chips did it. So I guess the question is, I think on the one hand, it's not really panic stations because, those chips have been manufactured, they're out there, whether it's new or second hand, there is going to be availability for some time, I guess. But it is going to sort of tail off. So potentially it's going to be more of a used buy. But, just the concept of these processors, I just think that they've been game-changing in extending the life of platforms, right? And, the AM4 platform is so old at this point, but you can still get a really good gaming performance from this really, really old platform. And you could have bought, a motherboard with like Ryzen 1000 back in the day, and like through various BIOS updates, you're actually able to run, the 5700 and 5800 X3D, and it's still viable, right? It's to the point where I guess, the bigger point is whether your PCIe slot can handle, the kind of cut down interfaces of budget cards these days. That's been a bit of a concern there. But, what can I say? Let's pour one out for the 5700 X3D and the 5800 X3D. And there must have been some guy or a unit within AMD that basically said, hey, what if we did this crazy thing where we just stuck on like an extra chiplet of cache onto our processors? Look what it does for games. It's pretty fantastic. I guess the only regret I have is that, the concept that adding this gigantic pool of cache can actually fix so many games kind of speaks to the fact that, surely when you're dealing with CPU performance, you should be aware of that you've got like constrained cache available, so the concept that you just stick a lot more on there and get these gigantic performance boosts kind of sort of speaks to something isn't particularly great about CPU performance on gaming. But what can I say? I guess at some point the whole AM4 lineup is just going to be sunsetted. And to be fair, yeah, I mean AM5 is pretty special. It's worth updating to. But even so, I'll be sorry to see it go. Curious if we'll ever see any kind of more mainstream release for the 6-core parts that do remain potentially in existence, but I guess not. I've actually got this question here from iChoo Frames. With the 5700 X3D and my beloved 5800 X3D reaching end of life in the past year, how much further will these CPU behemoths endure, and what will be their legacy? I think their legacy is basically like, this is like crazy stuff. Somebody came up with this nutty concept and it actually paid off in spades to the point where it's been years since we've had like Halo products in the CPU space, but there they are. In terms of like the 5700 X3D, 5800 X3D, obviously the more demanding games become on the CPU front, the more diminished their returns will be. But at the same time, I still think they're going to be serviceable for some years yet until, new console generations come along, right? What do you think, Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, I would expect so. I'm just looking at the 9800X 3D review, and it's still these CPUs are still, within some range of the higher end, more modern offerings. I expect they should probably be good for, I mean, current generation software. I would expect it to continue for a very long time to come. And even next generation software, who knows exactly how fast Zen 6 will be if it's not paired with, a super fast pool of L3 there. And also with those next generation consoles, you have to consider the fact that the CPU clock is likely to be fairly low there as well, because of the limitations of producing an APU and the need to optimize the substrate probably for the GPU more there. So I'd suggest these CPUs can probably last for quite a while. Probably at some point you should consider upgrading to like a newer socket. But if you're not after the very highest margin of PC performance, a 5800X3D, 5700X3D, it's still reasonably, up there with current generation Intel and AMD CPUs.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on. Right, it's happening again. Last week, we reported about some crazy stuff happening with AMD's Strix Halo APU. So to, think of this as kind of like a super high-end integrated processor. It's got like 16 CPU cores, 32 threads, 40 RDNA 3.5 compute units. It's a monster of an APU, and it seems that the community is intent on putting it into extremely small form factors in order to produce best gaming handheld ever. Now, here's the thing, right? OneXPlayer have actually come up with their own concept, and I think it's probably a bit more sort of viable for the chip itself. But it's basically a flagship gaming and AI tablet, the Super X. It's using AMD's Ryzen AI Max Plus 395 APU, which is pretty much the top-end Strix Halo. 14-inch, 2.8K OLED screen, up to 128 gigabytes of memory. So, Oliver, we're kind of like eagerly awaiting how Strix Halo is going to sort of potentially work in a handheld.
Yeah.
But this one, it's kind of this one sort of makes a bit more sense, right? And it's sort of more similar to the Asus product that's already out there using Strix Halo.
Yeah. The kind of key difference between this and the Asus Flow tablet is this goes all the way up to 120 watts, whereas the Flow tablet, I think, is normally only 60 watts, and you can push it to 80 watts in so-called manual mode. So this is definitely a faster device, but probably also, you'd presume, a thicker and heavier device as well. But I really do like this chip for tablets as opposed to handhelds, like you said, because it has a great range of operating power. This can be a great chip at 120 watts. It can also be a good chip at 10 watts, even in some of the handhelds that we've seen. It's single chip. It's very easy to cool. It's got great CPU performance. It's got very good GPU performance as well. It also feels like a really good fit potentially for like ultrabook style laptops, very thin laptops, where you want good GPU performance, you want good CPU performance, but you'd realistically never fit a good quality discrete GPU in that kind of system. But here we should be talking about RTX 4060, potentially our 5060 class performance pretty easily, I would suggest, and probably tracking pretty well with like a PlayStation 5, as you've shown in your Plague Tale benchmarking from the other week there. At 120 watts, at least at higher wattages, it should be there. And given that it has I think a 2080 by 1800 display, that should be a reasonable target for a lot of software using that kind of GPU with some upscaling technologies. Plus, it has 120 gigabytes of RAM, which I'm quite fond of. My system here, my Mac Studio, has 120 gigabytes of RAM as well. And if you do any kind of like serious video editing, photo editing with some multitasking thrown in with lots of applications open at once, you can actually start to use a large portion of that RAM, which is quite useful. So for various professional applications, maybe less so for gaming, but for certainly various professional applications that you might be executing on this kind of machine, especially if you're using it as kind of like a desktop replacement, laptop replacement, tablet replacement, all these different hats that it could potentially wear, that could be quite compelling there for professional use cases. It also has, I think I'm reading here, 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports, which is very nice. I have a bunch of Thunderbolt devices around here because I have Macs, obviously. And Thunderbolt is a fantastic standard for displays, for storage devices, all kinds of external PCIe connection. It's a really terrific standard. Also potentially for like eGPUs, although I don't suspect you'd really need one with this kind of hardware on tap. Just a very flexible and very capable standard for expansion that, because it's so common in Apple land, there's tons of Thunderbolt devices out there, even if it's not as common in the PC world. And if you're into Windows tablets, I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of Windows tablets, but if you're if you're interested in a Windows tablet, I think this looks compelling. I'd also consider the Asus Flow device, which is obviously similar in a lot of respects to this device as well.
Absolutely. Tom, what do you think?
Oh, I'm a big fan of this sort of stuff. If I was in the market for a sort of tablet, sort of a Surface-style tablet hybrid, I'd go for something like this. I think more for the sake of creativity, productivity, work stuff, professional stuff than gaming. As Oliver says, it's kind of like, it seems better suited for that use case. In terms of form factor, in terms of the use of Strix Halo, it's a huge silicon, but it's got the surface area to really pack it in. Unlike the handhelds, which you guys covered quite recently, the GPD Win 5 and the with the huge battery pack on the back, which I had to kind of attach, and the Air Neo next to. But yeah, there's not much information. I mean, it is 12.5 millimeters thick, which is pretty good. That's pretty respectable. In the photos, that bears out. Vapor chamber in there to cool it down. And as Oliver says, the 120 watts TDP is scalable. If you don't want to use that can scale to whatever type of project you've got going on. But it's definitely compelling. It's kind of between, I think the Strix Halo kind of works very ideally for mini PCs, very ideally for like a console type of form factor. But, going the other extreme with handhelds feels like a stretch too far. Tablets and laptops feels like Ultrabooks feels like a very good middle ground for this sort of stuff.
Interesting. It's also got a VRR on the display, on the OLED display, which is pretty great, I think. I mean, the reservation I've got, I have been testing this device, which has got Strix Halo in it, right? Yeah. And I'm really sort of happy with it. I think it's really cool. I don't really have a huge amount of time at the moment, what with the all of the independent stuff going on to actually get that review done. But I'm liking it. The only criticism I really have of it at the moment is that the fan is loud at like full 120 watts. So how this like super thin tablet is going to handle that, I don't know. Yeah. Obviously, there's very different forms of cooling. So hopefully it's decent. But yeah, I just love the little announcement video they've done. This time we're going all in. That kind of like sums up what Strix Halo is all about. It's kind of like, just kind of nutty what people are trying to do with all of with this like really powerful APU, and then trying to get it into as small a device as possible. I think it's fantastic. Yeah. The Neo one I'm particularly interested in because they're aiming for a fully integrated handheld there. And to be fair, some of their devices that they've done in the past, they have I think they've managed to get 56 watts through on their handhelds. So that should still be a pretty potent amount of horsepower there with Strix Halo. And obviously not the full 120 watts. But
I think the GPD Win 5 is within 10% or so in Fire Strike of an RTX 4060. At about 55 watt TDP, 57 watt TDP as tested in the video that they published.
A desktop 4060.
Desktop 4060, I believe so, yeah. You're getting a pretty good percentage of that scaling when you look at the lower wattages there, potentially at half the wattage, half the maximum wattage. You're getting a pretty compelling result, I think.
Yeah, there is going to be. It's the big sort of max P versus max Q debate, really. Which is sort of where does the silicon operate at its peak efficiency level versus peak performance. I guess that's what they're aiming for on this one. There's been some good sort of testing by the Forks on this, and I'm sure he's going to continue to be on top of all of these handheld devices because that's what he does. But I'm just loving it. I just love the fact that I don't know, maybe obviously it's a niche case device. It's a niche device, right, for a small audience, but that's kind of what PC gaming's all about, really. It's about the diversity of hardware out there. And I just love the fact that somehow a business case can be made for these devices because they are going to be quite expensive, right? Especially we're using Strix Halo. Anyway, let's move on. Okay, so we've just been talking about unfeasibly powerful electronics being crammed into extremely small form factors. And Oliver, this one, though, this takes the cake, doesn't it? It's not an official device. It is a sort of homebrew project. But the audacity of it, we had to talk about it, really.
Yeah, it's pretty insane here. This is a totally DIY project, like you mentioned. But it's basically like this laptop board shoved into a tablet enclosure, a very thick tablet enclosure, with a 4K 12.5-inch screen, an Intel Core i9 14000HX, which is basically a mobile 14900K, and an RTX 4090 laptop GPU, which, again, that's not a full 4090. It's based off of the 103 die. It is similar in terms of silicon to a 4080, maybe in terms of performance. It'd be more similar to a desktop 4070 Ti in a lot of implementations.
Which in itself is still...
it's pretty nuts. Yeah, it's pretty nuts. It's a pretty wild project. It's obviously very demanding in terms of power. They're talking about like 175 watts under load, which is, quite something for a handheld. It's also very thick. It's not very comfortable looking either. It's kind of very angular. It's not exactly ergonomically sculpted, although you wouldn't necessarily expect that out of a DIY project like this. It's also just like this size of that screen, a 12.5-inch screen in the palm of your hands. It's just an insane size. Like, even, relative to any handheld you're familiar with, this is just dramatically larger, this screen that's like multiple times as large as like a Switch or Steam Deck or something, certainly. It also only has a 50 watt-hour battery internally. Probably lasts very little time on battery. It's kind of, incidental to the use of the device, I'd suggest. And to run it at full bore, I'd imagine you would need power connected anyways. So this is the kind of project that's like totally impractical. The Strix Halo handhelds have like nothing on this in terms of their ambition. But, kind of going back to Strix Halo, I think that'd be the more sensible way to approach this kind of project because, you get that single chip, easy to cool, great GPU performance, great CPU performance, demands less power, can be scaled more reasonably. This is something that in comparison is just not really practical along any kind of axis. And just the cost that go into a device like this, like an RTX 4090 powered laptop, is going to be something that's going to cost in the realm of thousands of dollars, and scaling that onto a handheld, these are some pretty intense expenditures here. And I do think Strix Halo would make a lot more sense for kind of the practical side of the impractical, the possible side of the impossible with these kinds of devices, I'd suggest, because those are, at least you look at them and it's like, okay, you're making some kind of crazy concessions and decisions around the device, but it's still like recognizably, you look at the GPD Win 5, and that is very similar in terms of its form factor to like a Switch 2 or something. It is not that crazy. Yeah. This is a totally different realm of just craziness. So I think this is a cool kind of project, but in terms of actually being a reasonable kind of device you'd actually want to use, I don't think it meets that criteria. But it's cool that people are doing stuff like this. I think it's cool.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, Tom, what do you think?
Oh, it's another nutty invention, and it's great to see. I love the novelty of these Frankenstein's monsters style handhelds that we're seeing. I think it's great. If nothing, just to like fire up the imagination of what's possible. I don't think it's practical on any level. Like, weight, thermals, power usage, the battery, how's that all going to coalesce into a usable product? I'm reading that thermals are getting to 75 C, which is, impressive given the hardware, but is that what you want in the palm of your hand all the time? Probably not. Well. And also the weight of it, a regular RTX 4090 weighs, it's quite hefty. it's quite hefty, and they've stripped it down for the mobile chipset, obviously, but still, it's going to have a good bit of heft as well. So whether you'd want to lug it around and hold it up for extensive play sessions, I'm not so sure. It's probably more practical as a kind of a plug and play device. You take it somewhere and plug it into like a portable mini PC with a screen attached to it, essentially. But it's not very useful as a actual mobile device. But yeah, it is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing, right? I mean, one thing that I do like about it, about some of these, well, certainly gaming laptops and the tablets, is that, a really sort of decently sized screen particularly when you get older and your sort of short range vision is a bit more blurry without having to like use reading glasses or whatever. A bigger screen is actually pretty great from that perspective. And at the same time, when you're looking at when we're talking about that OneXPlayer tablet, the concept of having an OLED screen, great resolution VRR, that's all pretty great as well. There's one thing that bothers me about the whole mobile gaming concepts, though, when it comes to these higher power devices, and it's something you pointed out in the Mac Cyberpunk review there, Oliver, and it's the fact that on a Mac, you can play Cyberpunk plugged in, you can play Cyberpunk from battery, and the performance is the same. Now, the issue is that a lot of these gaming laptops are drawing so much power that the battery can't supply that level of power. And so performance is kind of throttled back simply because the battery isn't capable of delivering over 150 watts or whatever. And so, necessarily the mobility is limited. Whereas with the Mac, it kind of just works, doesn't it? I think that's like a sort of secret weapon, so to speak, and I think it's something that PC laptop manufacturers really need to consider, especially on smaller devices that where conceivably it's not a desktop replacement, where people are likely to actually use it as a mobile gaming platform.
Yeah, that actually seems like an area where these Strix Halo devices, not to go back to that, but where they actually seem reasonable. Because, a Strix Halo device at a good wattage, at 80 watts or 100 watts, is still within the range that a healthy battery could supply, certainly, at a good capacity there. And with the Macs, like you're seeing, peak usage on that M4 Max of 70 watts, 80 watts during gaming, maybe at most, more typically in the kind of 50 to 60 watt range, actually. And that's a level that obviously the system can supply just fine. And there is no performance degradation whatsoever on the Mac when you are using it on battery versus when you're using it plugged in, which is, it's a kind of key element to the appeal of those devices that, to me, I don't really think of because I use Mac laptops all the time. But you do have that split in terms of capabilities when you look at PCs, even doing things dramatically, like disabling the GPU or dramatically power scaling down those GPUs. So, that's definitely a big compromise that you get with these PC gaming laptops that I kind of feel like shouldn't be there for a laptop product, but unfortunately very often is.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's move on. This is now the time where we roll out Supporter Q&A, which is the part of the show where every week I post on Patreon to ask our supporters for their questions, queries, comments on the topics that we're going to be discussing in any given direct. Questions-wise, we choose the ones that we're kind of best equipped to answer. Going to kick off with this one from the Adam. Hello, DF crew, ! How can the new and rumoured Xbox models make customers curious? Why should I switch to a PC-like model with AMD architecture when I can just use PC builds with Nvidia technology? AMD isn't just going to magically pull some competitive tech out of a hat to compete, are they? Also, the backwards compatibility argument doesn't hold up anymore in the age of Games Pass, does it? Who's going to buy these machines? Congrats to your freedom. I've got some thoughts about this, but the thing is, Oliver, Windows isn't really associated with a super high quality gaming experience. So I can kind of see what the Adam is talking about here. Similarly, whatever you want to say about Nvidia, they are undoubtedly at the forefront of delivering new gaming technologies in the graphics space. So how is this going to differentiate itself, do you think?
Well, obviously the backwards compatibility stuff, I think at least initially will probably be Xbox exclusive to some substantial degree. And maybe that does matter less for Xbox Series games, but it still matters for Xbox One games, for 360 titles, for original Xbox titles. I'd presume that would be exclusive, and I do think that matters. But I'm not sure the extent to which the next-gen Xbox interface will be unique to the Xbox models, at least at first. Because obviously that's the case for the first Xbox handheld, the Xbox ROG Ally, the ROG Xbox Ally, whatever it's called. I always miss that one. That is going to be the first device to have this kind of next generation Xbox on PC interface. And then there's some promises that eventually that will percolate to the older ROG Ally models later on, the non-Xbox branded ROG Ally models. But we don't know exactly how long it will take for that interface to percolate over to the kind of generalized PC market, how long that will take, if there will be any exclusive features like, for instance, suspend, resume, sleep, awake, things like this that are kind of key to the console experience that might not be present necessarily in those initial implementations, or maybe present in those initial implementations on the Xbox PC side of things. So there's some question about like how far Microsoft goes with exclusivity of features and of that interface. And I think if they do make that interface exclusive to the Xbox effort, at least at first, that will be a key selling point in favor of that effort, because there's not really a correspondingly strong interface on the PC side of things, right?
Yeah. I've got some thoughts on this, but Tom, I mean, obviously backwards compatibility with series software is going to be pretty good, I'd say, for those who are invested in the Xbox digital library. So that's cool. But is there anything, I mean, the console war is effectively over.
It is.
If we think about it. So, that's an interesting question that the Adam is asking here. It's like, well, who is going to buy these machines apart from people who want to play their old Xbox games, which, that's not, obviously there's about 30 million of those series consoles owners out there who might be looking to upgrade, but I don't know. What do you think?
It really boils down to whether what you buy a console for. Like, for me, it's really just to have everything in a box that works perfectly with no tinkering involved. Everything's fluid, everything just flows. You don't need to optimize like drivers. You don't need to. Although these days you do need to wait for patches. That's definitely a reality of modern gaming.
Yeah.
But it's not. It's really by what degree is Microsoft going to turn this into a flexible device that will have as much functionality as a regular PC, or how much of that will be hidden behind the scenes behind an Xbox layer, I guess, like a Steam Big Picture mode type thing. Is it going to be branched off when you boot it up into PC mode or Xbox mode? How's it going to be split out, and how they kind of going to keep this a kind of streamlined Xbox experience? So I could see the value in a PC, like a 2-in-1 model like that. You boot it up, Xbox there, PC there, choose which direction you want to go.
Right, I get what you're saying. So a console and a PC in one has value because it is capable of doing many more things, tasks. Right.
But then, if it's just you're booting into Windows essentially, and everything's functional from there, and you should, in theory, have all the bells and whistles of a true, being able to upgrade with an Nvidia card or any other parts, then I think I'd rather get a PC, a regular PC, and just do it that way. So it really comes down to Microsoft and how well they integrate the Xbox layer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also how well they basically get rid of everything that's a pain in the bum to do with Windows. Driver updates specifically. I mean, Steam Deck handles that all just perfectly well. Just like a console would. There's a system update available. Please press this button to download it, and that's it. That's pretty much it. I think the other thing that is potentially, and I've talked about this on the direct prior, is that if essentially the business model is to A, produce a console, but B, also to produce an alternative to the current PC pre-built market. The concept of having to buy a CPU and a GPU in favor of an SoC could actually have some benefits, but there could be other questions there about expandability, and upgrading. How would that be handled? It's a bit tricky. I think we're still missing some key fundamentals in what the vision actually is going forward.
For sure.
I think that's the bottom line. Yeah. Who can say at this point? The competitive tech, though, I think AMD is making some, big strides there. I think FSR4 was a major turning point for them because they do actually have an upscaling technology that is really, really good. And they've got to follow suit with everything else that Nvidia is doing. And, we've seen some interesting stuff from them that suggests that they're taking this very, very seriously. And obviously, last week, Alex was talking about AMD's jet-dense geometry format, which certainly looks very, very interesting. So, great stuff ahead. But yes, I mean, when you're in the PC space, it is basically okay, I'm going to buy a PC with an AMD CPU and an Nvidia GPU. That's the sort of
exactly.
That's the sort of mindset that people have got to that AMD and Microsoft have got to compete against. And backwards compatibility is only going to have so much of an impact there, I think. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. This is a big one. Daryl Stewart asks, is there a credible scenario in which the profitability of making GPUs for the AI market becomes so overwhelmingly favorable that there is no commercial incentive for Nvidia or AMD to produce any gaming GPUs at any level? Not even APUs for consoles. This is kind of like an expression of one of the fears that is manifesting, bearing in mind just how successful Nvidia specifically is at the moment in terms of essentially having a stranglehold on the AI silicon market. Oliver, what do you think about this? I've got my own thoughts, which I'll share shortly, but I'm curious what you think about it.
I mean, right now, there is an argument that is to a substantial degree the case, because like if you look at a B100 GPU, for instance, Nvidia is selling that for like $35,000 or so. Bill of materials, I have seen some third-party analysis that says it's like in the $6,000 range, $5,000, $6,000 to produce one of those GPUs, which is a dual die GPU product. And it's produced on a pretty similar process node to consumer GPUs. It's the 4NP process as opposed to the 4N process. Right. But I think a big part of the problem here is that if you give up gaming, you might be giving up gaming forever or for a long time. And data center demand isn't necessarily infinite, and AI demand may not be sustained, exponentially into the future as it has been thus far. Right now, Nvidia's data center and non-data center revenue split is something like 80% data center, 20% non-data center, of which gaming is some portion. But it could go back to something closer to 50-50 or 40-60 even, like it was pre-AI, pre this AI boom. And if that happens, I think you'd want a gaming market to return to and to have some revenue in, and to not have ceded all of that market to a competitor. Because between AMD, Nvidia, and now Intel, if one market participant withdraws, then there will be multiple market participants claiming their market share, right? And continuing to iterate with new gaming products and new gaming drivers and things like that. So I think definitely the profit center for companies like Nvidia, definitely the profit centers or potential profit centers continue to remain in the AI sphere and the data center sphere, where there are enormous profits to be made. But I don't think they want to leave the gaming market, because the potential for that data center market to not necessarily always be there with the huge profit margins that it entails at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Here's my theory on this is that, basically, it comes down to availability of wafers, right, to accommodate all of these different markets. I'd say that obviously when the 50 series cards came out, there were a shortage of cards, right, and there were some crazy prices as a result of that. However, the AI boom has not subsided. Nvidia is still selling gigantic amounts of silicon and to the market. However, I can go onto the internet now. I can buy a 5090, £2,000, anything up to like £2,400. All of the models seem to be available. It kind of suggests to me that Nvidia is able to sustain a market where they can sell gaming GPUs while at the same time selling a gigantic amount of AI hardware as well. So, if that shortage had continued, that would suggest that there was like a shortage of 4nm wafers. Mm-hmm. And then there would be prioritizing whatever's giving them the best margin. However, the sort of ground truth, as it were, in terms of retail suggests that actually there is room to actually service the AI market while at the same time servicing the gaming GPU market at the same time as well. I also think from a business perspective, it's really difficult to justify putting all your eggs in one basket. Because you just never know what's going to happen next.
That's very true.
So I think, I don't really think there's a problem about it at the moment. I think the issue is possibly that there is a stagnation in terms of hardware design, because 50 series is running on pretty much the exact same process node as 40 series. So new products have emerged, but they aren't game changing in any way, like 40 series eclipse 30 series, for example. Mm-hmm. So I think that's probably the more curious thing to be taking a look at, as the extent to which not running your new GPU architecture on the latest process node is impacting the market. But at the same time, I don't really see AMD doing anything different, because they too are in the same markets as Nvidia. Tom, what do you think?
I think the point about not putting your eggs in one basket holds true for this one, and that is, if in terms of business sense, you just want to diversify into as many markets as you can. Samsung does this brilliantly with just about every form of tech under the sun, and it's definitely true of the that Nvidia's and AMD's sort of area as well. You've got to have a backup plan if one thing fails. AI is not going anywhere. Obviously, gaming is not going anywhere, and there's going to be a huge demand for gaming products going into for decades and decades. I don't see any change there. So really, it's about the bottleneck. Whether there's factory, capacity and the materials to make them.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is that if AI had such a huge impact on available wafers for chips, it wouldn't just be GPUs that would be in danger, right? Smartphones. Basically, Nvidia and AMD would be buying up every wafer at whatever the price.
That's true, yeah.
Because there'd still be gigantic margins there, and yet we're still able to sustain this world where silicon is being used for a huge diversity of different things. I'm not hugely concerned about availability of GPUs. Obviously, there was issues with the launch of 50 series and indeed RDNA 4 that saw some pretty egregious price increases. But, what are we now? 7 months on, 7 months on, and availability seems to be fine overall.
Yeah, I would say maybe one or two caveats to that point. One thing is that these products are being made on last generation processes by the standards of mobile phones. It's like your new mobile phones, your Apple products, those are all being made for the most part on TSMC 3 nanometer processes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Especially on the high end. Now, maybe with older products, you're still looking at like 4 nanometer, 5 nanometer class processes from different vendors. But for the newest stuff, you're looking at 3 nanometer almost exclusively your Samsungs, your Apple phones, your Xiaomi phones, things like this potentially. And then in terms of the issue of capacity, that's actually an interesting concept, because I think consumer capacity is well stated at the moment. When you look at the back orders for like NVIDIA's B100 chips, last year they were reported as having a 12-month backlog for those chips. So I'm not sure that market has been fully sated. And again, those are, extremely high margin chips. Maybe at some point they do perceive that they will have some slackening of that demand and they'll be able to meet demand fully, but I'm not sure they're there at the moment, especially when you look at like these new AI installations with like just gigantic chip orders. And not all those orders are for B100s, not all those orders are for NVIDIA GPUs, but a very large proportion of these new data center build-outs are indeed B100s, are next generation NVIDIA GPUs, Rubin GPUs, whatever might come down the line. And that will take some significant capacity. So yeah, I'm not too sure. I would expect that over the long haul, they have some estimation they'll be able to meet demand, at least on the current margin, but getting there might be challenging.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's move on to the next question. This one from Justin Valero. Hi, gents! ! Where do you think the ROG Ally Z1 Extreme will land in terms of future support, considering the Xbox Ally X reports modest Z2 performance upgrades and the vanilla Xbox Ally having a cut down in brackets Steam Deck SoC? Oliver, my thoughts on this, fairly straightforward. Z1 Extreme's still pretty good, right? I think it's a pretty impressive chip. It's certainly a world apart from the Steam Deck level of performance in, once you give it a decent amount of wattage. Z2, I think it's another one of those iterative bumps. Pretty good, but I guess Z1 kind of sits in the middle almost. compared to those two Xbox allies that are coming out.
Yeah, I'm not so sure the Z1 Extreme devices are being targeted explicitly, but I'd imagine that if you're putting work into validating and verifying a game on Steam Deck, that work should carry over pretty well over to the Z1 Extreme, because especially at like 15 watts at reasonable wattages, it is fairly comparable. Now, if you step up the wattage, if you're going to 35 watts, you are getting a categorically better experience than the Steam Deck. But at these kind of lower, more reasonable wattages, you're talking about like usually 20%, 30% ahead in some scenarios. More similar in other scenarios than others. But I would think that is primarily because the Steam Deck continues to exist and not because the Z1 Extreme is a particular optimization target. But yeah, the Z2 Extreme is pretty similar to the Z1 Extreme. I think it's like 10%, 20% off in a lot of benchmarks at ISO wattage at the same wattage. And that's not too exciting now. Unfortunately, I don't think there are any Zen 4 APUs that are planned at the moment. From like Linux driver leaks, it's come out that it's quite unlikely that there will be Zen 4 APUs in the pipeline. Maybe into 2026 or 2027, we could see some next generation APUs from AMD that might have the next generation graphics architecture in them. But until then, I think we're going to see a lot of devices that are kind of having graphics capability that's more in line with last generation consoles, more in line with something like an Xbox One, a PS4, than a current generation console necessarily, unless you push them really hard with extra wattage, or you have something like ridiculous like a Strix Halo product. But I don't think that's going to be a very mainstream proposition kind of across the spectrum of devices. I don't think you're going to see very many of those sold at all, right?
Yeah, I guess the question is what Justin here means by future support, because it's going to receive driver updates,
Yeah.
So that's going to be happening. I guess it's the case of the Xbox bolt-ons, the Xbox project. They've already committed to it arriving at some point for the older ROG Ally. So, I guess it's just going to be. It will continue to have pretty decent support and performance, and at some point you'll get the Xbox stuff. That's kind of about it. I think my main concern about the whole the whole Ally Enterprise with Microsoft, I still don't understand why they went for such a kind of a low performance entry level SoC for a device that's apparently going to be significantly more expensive than a Steam Deck. I guess we'd have to wait for the US pricing to actually get a handle on that. But Tom, thoughts?
Only that if developers are kind of cognizant of the Xbox Ally specs when they have an optimization target in mind, that should pay off for the Z1 Extreme. There should be some payoff in how well that version performs on sort of low medium settings or whatever's going. So I think it won't affect things. I think there's going to be a net positive for the Z1 Extreme overall.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. Obviously, Tom, we were at Ninja Theory a couple of weeks ago, and Steam Deck verification for Hellblade 2 was something that they were really, really proud of. It took some work to get there, but I can't help but think that this kind of work is not just for the benefit of Steam Deck, but also for the benefit of this non-X Ally that they've got coming along. Just kind of makes sense there. It was interesting to see the range of performance improvement we actually got there with that verified push.
Yeah. I was surprised that they really made such a big point of it, didn't they? Deck verified, and they seem very proud of it. They had it next to kind of a line of other versions, mostly the consoles, right? Series X, Pro, and PS5, all laid out for us to test. And you really went in on the Steam Deck side.
Yeah, I decided just to give it a look because, I'm a big fan of Oliver's Too Big for Steam Deck videos.
They're great.
And it really is suggesting that we're kind of like hitting a brick wall in terms of really challenging PC games running on Steam Deck. And, Hellblade actually said at Ninja Theory said they watched your video.
Yeah.
And you weren't hugely sort of optimistic about Hellblade's outlook on the Steam Deck, but they have turned it around.
I looked at Hellblade 2 on the kind of the lower power platforms, on Series S, on the ROG Ally, on the Steam Deck, And I actually found that, on Series S, it's great. On ROG Ally, still pretty good, still a saleable experience there with some upscaling in the mix. You're getting pretty good frame rates. And of course, there you have the benefit of VRR to kind of salvage a slightly wobbly frame rate, maybe in that kind of 30 FPS to 50 FPS range. But on Steam Deck, it didn't really have the GPU throughput to just deliver a good enough experience, even at like 720p with FSR upscaling, XeSS upscaling, whatever. It was not a very good experience there necessarily, and it would dip to like, in some of the more extreme scenarios, I had it, I think, dipping to about 20 FPS. So apparently, that's been ameliorated to a large degree, and the performance is a lot better now, according to Tom's coverage. So I'm certainly glad to see that. But yeah, that was not necessarily a brilliant performer initially. Now it seems to be much better.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's move on. This question comes from Hans. We're still talking handhelds here. Dearest gents, ! Looking at all the quote-unquote handhelds being announced, e.g. Strix Halo projects, what do you think might be the impact for a Steam Deck 2? Having nothing to report on that front by Valve or anybody else, I would be interested in your thoughts on a quote-unquote current estimation / state of hardware Valve Steam Deck 2. Cheers! ! Yeah, I mean, here's the thing, right? I mean, especially when you're looking at the Z2 Extreme that's going to be in the Ally X, it's like, we're seeing over each sort of generation. How can you describe it? I think iterative bumps is at the same wattage is the best description there, and Valve is on the record as saying they want a proper generational leap. Now, Oliver, we've had those rumors, obviously, about the PlayStation handheld, and based on the specs that are being suggested there, the logical conclusion should be that whether it's called UDNA or RDNA 5, that does seem to be some sort of generational leap, which has made Sony think, actually, we could probably do a handheld here. And maybe that's the same generational leap that Valve will look at and think, hey, maybe we should be doing a Steam Deck 2.
Yeah, I personally think they're going to wait for next generation architecture, because among the current landscape of devices from, RDNA 2, RDNA 3, RDNA 3.5, whatever APUs might be out there, there's not really a compelling upgrade point for them at 15 watts. Either in an actually existing design or in a design you could imagine in your head. Too much there. I could definitely see an argument in favor of a more incremental upgrade approach. I think that's a reasonable approach to go down, but Valve seems intent not to upgrade for like a 20% or 30% performance upgrade at the same wattage. And in that context, I don't think Strix Halo changes the game, because it really needs to be fed with high wattages in order to perform at its best. At 15 watts, again, it's not a huge advantage over other handhelds out there. I don't think Strix Point changes the game either, again, unless they're willing to commit to a much higher TDP range for a potential Steam Deck 2 that would potentially, require a big change in design, a big change in strategy. They don't want to do that. So I would suggest that like RDNA 5, UDNA, whatever that ends up being, will probably be the kind of inflection point for next generation Steam Deck product. And I would expect them probably to make fairly similar trade-offs to Sony in terms of achieving good performance at 15 watts.
Okay, yeah, good stuff. Thoughts there, Tom?
Only that, I mean, I can't see, obviously Strix Halo is just a huge behemoth chipset. I don't think they could possibly use that, but I think Oliver's right on the money by saying that it's going to come down to another generational, the next evolutional generation of AMD's fabrication process there. If they come up with a new design, new chipset, that's probably where we're going to veer, or where Valve will go towards for Steam Deck 2. I'm expecting in terms of the hardware as well, like they're probably going to match the Switch 2 in terms of having a 1080p display. That seems to be where things are going, and that seems to be a logical target. But yeah, 15 watts has to be kind of the goal there. I mean, in terms of power output. Otherwise, we're resorting to, some extremes in terms of the design that I'm not sure people would be comfortable with in terms of a handheld.
Yeah. I think ultimately the weird thing about all of this is that we've seen several generational leaps now from Steam Deck. And we've seen, process shrinks, and we've not really seen like what you would typically expect to get from that kind of thing, specifically process shrinks, for example. Steam Deck was 7 nanometer and we're kind of now at 4 nanometer, and there's still no sort of game-changing performance boost that you would expect, and it ultimately must come down to something like memory bandwidth, which has been historically constrained on APUs and hasn't really changed a huge amount. I think that's probably the reason there. I can only assume that, at some point, the sums are going to work out in terms of memory bandwidth, in terms of increased compute, in terms of machine learning features. I think you can look at Switch 2, and just see how much of a game changer DLSS has been there, and kind of map that onto PC handhelds as well. A similar level of machine learning quality upscaling there. That's going to be a big thing as well. So what can I say? I guess it's just wait and see. I do think, though, that the signs are looking good for this next generation. Here's an interesting question from Captain Nooble. Dear amazing men at the forefront of games journalism who reside at the foundries where all kinds of digital goodness is forged. First of all, congratulations on your independence. This calls me to join Patreon to support all of you, as your content provides countless hours of fun. That's always nice to hear. Fun. Which games would you personally like to see ported to the Switch 2? I personally keep my hopes up for a port from Capcom's Resident Evil series, especially the latest remakes with hopefully 60 FPS and DLSS. Since Resident Evil 4 runs well on my Steam Deck, I'm hopeful this can be achieved. I presume once more Switch 2 dev kits get out into the hands of developers, we'll see more ports in the future. Thank you, and best regards, Captain Nooble. Tom, Switch 2 ports. We've kind of, it's been quite interesting. I expected an early deluge of ports.
Me too.
But we didn't quite get them. There are reports this week that Nintendo is asking for, system-specific features for those ports that make them stand out. But what sort of games would you like to see on there that are sort of within the realms of possibility?
Well, I think we've got to get the basics out there. The Call of Duty series, if it hasn't already been announced, that would be great to see on there. That would be a good starting point, and I think technically that's very viable. Assassin's Creed Shadows, we mentioned earlier, I think it's ambitious, but it's the best one in my view. It's one of the greatest Assassin's Creed games, and to have that in a handheld format, perfect. The RE Engine games as well. I think Street Fighter 6 is, maybe sets a precedent in some respects, but it's also arguably one of the least sort of demanding. There's no open world stuff. There's no ray tracing, so it's like the RE Engine Resident Evil games. They've got like all of them. Got so many to go through.
Yes, there is a long and storied history there. Devil May Cry, etc., etc. It just keeps going.
Yeah, for sure. Monster Hunter Wilds. There's a lot of stuff that they can put over. Dragon's Dogma, I think we mentioned in a previous direct. That one's maybe the holy grail where they've really Capcom might have a challenge.
1 or 2?
Oh, 2.
Oh,
yeah.
2. Yeah,
yeah, for sure.
2 is going to be significantly challenging. Yeah,
It's a tough one.
Anything else?
I think that's the lot for me. Oh, no. The big one, Elden Ring. I think that really has to make the jump.
Oh, that's happening, of course, isn't it? That's going to be coming very, very soon. We can't wait to take a look at that one. Oliver?
Well, in terms of games that I would actually like to see that I think would scale well, I'd think about some lighter current generation games. Think of games like Battlefield 6. I think that's one of the lighter current generation games we've seen in a while. Surprisingly. And I think that would be doable at 30 FPS, probably 40 FPS maybe a wobbly 60 FPS or 60 FPS only in some modes. Like we saw last generation with like Battlefield 1 at launch on PlayStation 4 in like domination or smaller player count modes that would run at 60 FPS, and maybe in Conquest a lower update there. So that could be a possibility. Also Doom the Dark Ages, I'd love to play that on a handheld. I think that'd be super fun even if it was 30 FPS. Also the Call of Duty games like Tom mentioned, I think those would be pretty fun on Switch, and those should scale well given that they are current generation games, but they're also last generation games. But in terms of like games that I think would stress the hardware in interesting ways, in ways that might be revealing potentially, like Tom said, there's Dragon's Dogma. There are like some CPU demanding games. Baldur's Gate 3 would certainly come up in that conversation. I think Starfield would come up in that conversation. I'd also really like at some point to see full fat UE5, i.e. Lumen, Nanite, and Virtual Shadow Maps. in some games that are visually sophisticated. I'd think of games like Hellblade 2, maybe. I mean, that's a
100%
shot maybe that they wouldn't be able to match, but that would certainly be very compelling. I'm testing Mafia: The Old Country right now, and that game looks absolutely extraordinary. Again, these are kind of like wish list type games. I wonder how they would scale necessarily. Also, like maybe proper UE5 Fortnite, that would be certainly quite interesting with the full feature set there. I'd also like to see some demanding games that maybe aren't on commodity engines as much. So we are seeing like Star Wars Outlaws, for instance, coming out very soon. Alan Wake 2 on Northlight, potentially with like RT in the mix or something. I'd like to see some games that just push out the spectrum of what we think is possible on Switch. Bring that out there. I think we're seeing that very soon on September 4th with Star Wars Outlaws, but I'd love to see other titles in the mix there as well, but push out on the CPU or push out with crazy UE5 features. I'd especially be curious to see how that scales on the portable side of things, and then also scale out using these impressive third-party engines that are pushing out ray tracing and look really superb, that aren't just commodity engines like Unreal or Unity. So yeah, just a few thoughts there.
Yeah, a few thoughts from my perspective. I think there's basically a wealth of cross-gen titles from PS4 to PS5 that would be eminently doable on Switch 2. Control springs to mind immediately. That would just be fantastic, I think, on Switch 2. Potential even for ray tracing on that one, because I think that would be transformative, and I think the hardware could potentially do it. What can I say? Yeah, I echo the call for Call of Duty. Again, it's still cross-gen. I do think that makes it viable. I also think there's two sort of curveballs to think about. First of all, there's a lot of Switch 1 games which I think stand to actually get proper Switch 2 releases. I mean, when I was doing the back compat testing for The Witcher 3, the Switch 1 version running on Switch 2, it's like, okay, so it runs well now, but come on, the hardware can do so much more, than this. All of those sort of limitations that were put in place for the Switch 1, they can be lifted for Switch 2. So there's a lot of games, and it's, not just Doom the Dark Ages, the prior id Tech games, I think, would just fly on that hardware. I think it would be fantastic. Potentially even 60 FPS, which I think would be cool. Another sort of curveball, I think, there is a pretty good argument for Sony to embrace the Switch 2, certainly in the years before their own handheld comes out, assuming it comes out at all. And, you could put out Marvel Spider-Man remastered onto Switch 2, and it would sell like the clappers, right? There's the original God of War. The thing about those games is that they still look awesome, and based on the fact that they looked awesome on a base PlayStation 4, it stands to reason they'll look just as good, potentially even better on a Switch 2. So there's a lot of really, a huge wealth of potential. I guess the only danger is, just talking about old games when you really want to see new ones on the Switch 2, don't you?
Yeah.
Fundamentally. But yeah, I mean, the potential there is huge, and I can understand that Nintendo is basically asking developers to, curate what they actually want to have on the platform, because it could become a deluge.
I think, there's at least there's some funny situations though, like adding Switch 2 features just for the sake of it. Like Street Fighter 6 has a few of those, and they're just party modes where you got to waggle the Joy-Cons. I don't know. It just seems a bit, if they're just bolted on for the sake of it, it seems like a bit of a waste. But I suppose it does no harm. If it's just an extra that you'd have to touch, then that's fine.
I just love the way some of these phrases end their way, find their way into the gaming lexicon.
Waggle.
the concept of waggle, the one which sort of raised politically correct alarm bells for me yesterday. I saw a tweet talking about super deformed artwork.
Oh yeah, Final Fantasy
in the 21st
9.
The 21st century, would you really be using the term super deformed?
No, you're right.
And yet it's now part of the parlance, and it just sort of passes without comment.
Yeah, you're right. I hadn't thought of that. It kind of started with Final Fantasy 9, I think, because people were like looking at hyper realistic Final Fantasy 8 characters, and then Squaresoft went, okay, actually people want more cutesy 16-bit style designs, and that's one of the games that started that phrase, I believe, anyway.
Well, no, super deformed goes way back into like
the
annals of 8-bit gaming.
God.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wouldn't be invented now.
Anyway, it wouldn't be invented now. Yeah. Anyway, let's move on. Final question. This one comes from Angry Cloud shouting at AI. Hi, DF crew, long-term listener, first-time subscriber. Thanks for that. Really appreciate that. With the Xbox Series X supply dwindling to nothing in Scandinavia, I've been considering getting one before it disappears from shelves. It would, however, primarily be used for back-compat Xbox 360 and Xbox One games, which made me wonder if a used Xbox One X would be a better option due to its smaller footprint and more console-like appearance in 2025 as compared to the Series X Behemoth. So what are your thoughts? Is the improvement to load times from the SSD, FPS boost and future-proofing of the Series X worth it? Spoilers, yes. Or is the One X the hero I deserve rather than the hero I need? Cheers! Exclamation point. Oliver, this one's pretty clear-cut, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I would go with the Series X personally, because there are a lot of games with BC enhancements, with 60 FPS support, with the mooted FPS boost that was so key early on in the Series S's life cycle. Games like Final Fantasy 13-2, Gears of War 3, the Dragon Age games, Fallout, the Sonic games. We've covered this a lot, John. Covered that quite a lot, actually. They're all better on Series X than the Xbox One X, and in many cases, those are games that have the Haichi method of resolution upscaling as well, so they might be rendering at 4K or another similarly high resolution with that kind of 3x3 upscale there as well. It's also just a nicer machine to use day to day. It will have a longer life. The OS isn't so pokey. Whenever I use one of the Jaguar hard drive consoles, I always feel like I'm being transported back in time just because of how pokey and slow they tend to be in general operation. There's a lot of appeal in current-gen systems, even just in the way they generally tend to operate and tend to be used. And of course, there's also the future-proofing argument where you are going to see Xbox Series X releases for the next few years at least. It's going to continue for a fair bit of time to come. Whereas with the One X, I mean, there is still a trickle of new releases, but it's a fairly small trickle, fairly minimal trickle, and also you would not want to play games on the One X in the year of our Lord 2025 anyways. Games are not being released in very cromulent form, as it were, on a caliber machine.
Yeah,
sure. I think the other thing, of course, is the One X releases. It was like the effort level sort of diminished pretty quickly. You got a port, but in many cases the port wasn't really worthy of the One X silicon. It just seemed like dare I say it, a bit of an afterthought. I think another thing to bear in mind is quick resume, which you can get on a One X. Quick resume's just great, really is cool, and it works on older games. I mean, it's fantastic. Also, obviously it's going to be more expensive than the One X, but it's literally newer hardware, less prone to failure. I think that's another thing to bear in mind there. What do you think, Tom? I mean, I think it's a pretty one-sided argument, but any additional points?
It's very clear-cut. I mean, credit to Microsoft for building some really powerful consoles over the years. Series X and One X were top of their game for their respective generations as base consoles. Kind of at the end of their life cycle, One X was obviously top of the game there. But it's I think, going back to what Oliver said, like I've picked up the One X a couple of times because I've got one here which is set to a Region A for Blu-rays, and so I genuinely have a use case for it because it's my Region A Blu-ray player for American imports, where it's region locked and it's already preset, so I pick it up, and the amount of faff I have to go through to
the system update is what's the best way to describe it?
Glacial.
Let's be kind, extended.
Yeah. I can't believe we put up with a generation of that. It was and the menus, obviously, they're pokey is a good way to use it. Creaky is another good word. It just, everything feels just so slow. And I remember moving to Series X when it first came out and being just blown away just by the snappiness of the menus. It really made such a difference to the overall. It sounds so trivial, but it makes such a difference to the user experience of it. Games wise, FPS boost is obviously great, and that speaks for itself. We've got a lot of videos on that, and it's I think the Bethesda games stand out in my mind as being really big beneficiaries of that. Fallout and Skyrim and the rest of them. So no question, Series X.
Absolutely. I just think the work Microsoft has done generally in terms of backwards compatibility and, bringing those games kicking and screaming to modern consoles and often enhancing them, they've gone above and beyond, really. And if that results in an extra Series X sale, then, great. Because it really is pretty fantastic stuff there. Yeah, I mean, I'm just curious to see how that's going to continue going forward, but I suspect they kind of reached the end of the line. I think one more thing to bear in mind with the Series X versus the One X, Grand Theft Auto 4 runs with an unlocked frame rate, and on Xbox 360, that is. The One X version kind of like ping-pongs between being GPU limited and CPU limited, whereas the Series X is just not limited in either case. You're getting a 60 FPS experience there on GTA 4, which is pretty unique for a console. So I think that one's definitely well worth having. But again, what I would say is definitely Series X and not Series S for a couple of reasons. First of all, no physical media support. And secondly, on the Xbox One X games, you don't have access to them on Series S. You basically have to use the Xbox One S code path. So it's definitely the X that you want. But yeah, I mean, yeah, it's definitely a good reason to get one. Anyway, that was the final question there for the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share on the off chance you enjoyed it. Ring bells for notifications, especially now when we're fully independent and we're going through this transition period. Supporting us via our Patreon, patreon.com/Digital Foundry. Hugely important to support the team and support what we do. But that's all from us on this one. Thanks as ever for watching and supporting Digital Foundry. See you next week.